All right, here we are, week 4, Masterclass. It is 7 o'clock on Wednesday. This is actually live. We don't pre-tape this, and part of the reason is so we can get your guys' questions in, which of course, we want your questions, so either text them in, email, comment on any of the places that you're watching, but also means that some people are actually, for the first time in their life, watching a vice presidential debate. First time ever that anyone has actually cared about a VP debate. I don't know what that says, but it says something. So, Doyle, how you feeling?
You don't really want to
Okay, Autumn, how you doing over there?
I'm doing so good.
So good.
You know why?
Tell me.
My kids are at youth group right now.
That's right. So, if you haven't heard, there are about, I would imagine, about 200 youth on campus safely
Spaced out,
wearing masks, registered, and temperatures taken. But about 200 youth are on our campus right now, all different locations and places. And it's the first night back, and so we are very excited about that. And how many kids do you have at youth group?
3.
3?
I have 3 boys.
Wow, 3 kids.
1 middle schooler and 2 high schoolers.
Wow, okay, good for you. All right, Doyle. Still there, huh?
Yeah, I'm here. What do you need?
Still there.
What do you want?
All right.
What do you want?
Still there. That's why we're missing Matt, by the way, is because Matt, as you know, is head of youth department, and he is out with all the youths.
He'll be back next week, though, right?
I don't know. Will he be back?
He better be.
We'll see. Okay, so I'm going to take over. So we're going to do like a little different format tonight. Is normally Autumn does the outline, and then Matt does the like theological implications, right? Mm-hmm. And then Doyle does whatever Doyle feels like doing, and then
Which tonight we may all go out for pizza.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. So I'm actually going to do the outline tonight. So it's not. I actually had someone write that for me because my writing is so bad that you wouldn't be able to read it, and I did not have all the cool pictures and stuff that Autumn usually does. So I apologize for that. But what I lack in creativity, I make up for in. It's really going to be short. It's going to be short, really. That's all I've got. It's got to be short. All right? So let's go. We'll jump in. Here we are. James chapter 4, starting at verse 1. All right, so here's kind of the big idea. I'm going to jump back and forth. You know what? Can you throw me a pen? Because I might write stuff on here, too. We're going to see how. You may never let me do an outline again. All right, so there's kind of 3 major sections when it comes to this chapter. So the first one is verses 1 through 10, and then the second one is was it 1 through 10? So where are we at? 11 through 12 and 13 through 17. All right, so those are like the 3 major chapters. In the first one, I titled it, and I kind of came up with different titles just so you guys can remember kind of what's happening in there. The first thing that I titled was The World in the Church. Okay, so we've heard about this idea that you were supposed to be in the world but not of it, right? Well, what James is going to be talking about here is that there is an issue happening within the church, and the issue is that the church is not in the world, but the world is in the church. Okay, so that's kind of the main issue. And every point that's being made here, there is a reference that you can find, because what James does is, and I don't remember if we talked about this in the past, is James really gets a lot of his theological teachings from either Jesus or from the Psalms. And so you can trace all the ideas that he's talking about here back to what things that Jesus has said. And so this first part about the church and the world, and they can't be together, is in Matthew 5:24, okay? And so I don't think I wrote that, so I'll put that up here. And you're going to get, oh, you handed me a dud.
Well, they're all duds. They're so duds.
All right, here we go. Let's try this one. Matthew, there we go. That's all right. Matthew, what did I say it was?
5:24.
5:24, and that's going to be like kind of the where James is going to get his teaching from Jesus here. So here's the big idea, is that the world, and if you don't know what the world is, there's kind of 3 different references or things that the scriptures reference when it talks about the world, right? So there's like the literal world, which is like the earth, that God created. And then there is this other concept of world, and it is this fallen and broken place that we live. So kind of a rough definition I came up with is the world is a fallen and broken world. It's all the systems, beliefs, and values And so the world is influenced and controlled by Satan, who is the ruler of this world. Okay, so that's what he's talking about when he talks about the world here. It's a place that is controlled by Satan, and everything has been infiltrated by him. Okay, so then we have some sub-points. So I broke this down because 1 through 10, there's so much content, so much stuff going all over the place, that I broke it down again. So 1 through 10 is like the big section, and then 1 through 3, what we see here is I've titled Fight Club. Okay, so Fight Club. And what's happening here is James starts to address what's probably happening within the church. He doesn't explicitly tell us, but we're guessing that there's some type of fighting, some kind of conflict that's happening within the church. And he goes on to explain why this is. And he says the reason for all the conflict in the church is because you have the wrong motives. And where he starts to talk about, and I think Autumn's going to talk about this a little bit, is he says that you are being led by your desires and your passions. And what is that word that you have right here? Hedone. Okay. And that's the word that it's talking about here when it talks about pleasure. And this is actually where we get our word hedonism from. And hedonism is the belief or the philosophy that life is all about seeking pleasure, that the chief goal and end of life is to have as much pleasure as possible and avoid as much pain. And so he says, okay, so if the world operates on these systems that are controlled by Satan, and they're often driven by their desire to pursue pleasure, then what is happening within the church is you have chosen to follow Satan instead of God. And so he says that there's really, well, let me back up. He says that there's the motivation that is so strong that pushes us to kill and covet and quarrel and fight is really this desire to seek pleasure. And this could be anything. It doesn't just mean like sensual pleasures, because that's probably the first thing that comes to our mind. It could be pleasure to the desire to have money, the desire to have a success and acclaim and things like that. And he says, what you're doing is you are coming to, you're chasing after these things because of your pleasure, and instead of asking God, and this is where he starts to talk about when you have these desires, bring them to God and then ask God to fulfill those desires. And so if those are righteous desires, then God will fulfill them. And if he doesn't fulfill them, it's because you have the wrong motives. And so the idea here is this is, let's say that I'm praying and I'm like, God, I really, really need this extra income, or I need a job, or I need whatever. Those in themselves are good things, and God wants to provide those things for us. But if we're praying for those things because we want to have more than our next door neighbor, or because we want to go and spend it on frivolous things, then that would be we may be praying for the right things, but we're praying with the wrong motives. And so James says you need to check your motives when you're praying. So make sure you pray for the right things and pray for the right reason. Okay, then we have 4 through 6, and this is all about spiritual adultery. And so this is kind of, and I think you're going to talk about God's jealousy and things like that, but really the bottom line that he's talking about here is he says that you have two choices in life. You can either love God or love the world, but you can't love both, because once you love one of these, you hate the other. These things are mutually exclusive. And so he says that if you choose to love the world instead of loving God, this makes God jealous. Now, at first we put this in the context of like our own relationships, and we think, okay, jealous, that sounds a lot like a clingy ex-girlfriend or something like that, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is we were made to love God and and to receive his love in return. And what happens is when we decide to love the world instead of God, it makes God jealous, not because he needs the love, but because we need the love. And so because he loves us and we're choosing lesser things that are not going to fulfill us, it makes him jealous, not because he needs the love, but because we need it and we're rejecting it, okay? And so it's kind of like he is the answer. He is the medicine. He is the thing that we desire. And when we chase other things, it makes him long for that relationship, not because he needs the medicine, but because we need the medicine, if that makes sense. And then he ends with this good news that even though we continue to fail, God gives us grace. All right, and then the next place here we're going to go to is verses 7 through 10. And this is all about conflict resolution. So he's kind of walked us through this argument, kind of a loose argument, but he says, look, you guys are having lots of fights and quarrels. It's because you worship Satan, or you've allowed the world to infiltrate your thinking in the church. You have to choose. Are you going to choose to come to God with those desires and seeking those pleasures? You got to choose God or the world. And then here's how you're going to resolve this conflict, okay? Because all of that kind of flows together. He says this. He says that in order to resolve the conflict, it's going to start really with us. And we're going to have to humbly surrender to God's will. So we've got to choose. Is it God or is it the world? Because once we choose it's God and we surrender to him, we submit, and this is all about, and this is going to be a big theme, is repentance. When we do that, then not only will we have resolution in our conflict with God, but we will with other people as well. So as we seek God, come into a right relationship with him, we also are going to resolve the relationships with other people. He talks about this idea of not being double-minded, not trying to love God and the world, just to be singularly focused in your love. And the big thing here in the audience that he's kind of talking to is everyone, but especially those who have drifted away from their faith, who have seen that they have continued to choose the world over loving God, and they know, and this is people who call themselves Christians but have continued to disobey God. He says you need to turn your life around, you need to repent, and you need to begin following him. And so he actually has like 10 commandments that he puts in these 3 verses. And the 10 commandments are all action steps. And so there's things like this. He says submit, resist, come near, wash, purify, grieve, mourn, wail, change, humble. These are all things that are representing this idea that we're supposed to, as we realize that we've chosen other things instead of God, we are to grieve, or we're supposed to be sad, not all the time, but because we've messed up in repentance and we want to come back, okay? All right, let's go to the next section. These ones are a lot shorter, so I won't take nearly as long. Here we go, 11 through 12. This one I kind of titled, Speak No Evil. And this is all about the way that we talk to one another. So remember, we're talking about conflict within the church and why that arises and how to resolve it. And this is kind of like a practical application. Is here's one of the ways that you can keep from having conflict in the church and in your family. And he gets back to our words. And this is obviously a big theme for James, as he's talked about this in other chapters before. But he says, be careful how you talk to one another, and not just in the words that you use, but in the tone that you use it. Because you can say things, and we all know this is true, is we can say things and we're like, man, I really, I love you, right? That's not saying I love you, right? It's kind of saying I'd love to punch you is what that's really saying, right? I wouldn't, I don't, sometimes. Okay, and so he talks about being careful with our words and how we speak to one another. And then he references the law. And in this idea of the law is, and it doesn't explicitly say this, but a lot of the commentators think that he's talking about the law of love your neighbor as yourself. And this law is, okay, if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, then you're not going to talk negatively about them, because you don't want people talking about you that way or to you that way. And when we do that, what we're saying is that the law doesn't really apply to me, that I am above or I am beyond the law. And so what we're doing is we're not only breaking the law, but we're in return saying, because the law doesn't apply to me, right? And so we do this all the time. We do this when we're speeding and things like that. There's this part of us which we go, look, I'm breaking the law, but I don't know if it really applies to me. You know, you see this a lot when people cut in line. Does that ever just, oh my, I can't even, I'm getting heated thinking about it. Is people cut in line like, oh, that line's for everyone else, not for me. Well, that's what he's talking about here. Okay, and then the last part I titled, and this is verses 13 through 17, and I call this Christian atheism. And the reason why is because he's talking about people who claim to be Christians but live as if they don't believe, right? So they profess faith, but they live like they don't. And he's talking to primarily Christian businessmen, but then he applies it to everybody else. And so what he says here is he says, okay, you Christian businessmen who oftentimes would go and they would travel and they would make plans. I'm going to go to this city, I'm going to do this deal, and here's what this next year is going to look like, and the quarter goals and all that kind of stuff. He points out the fact that you have made all of these plans and you're talking about all this future, and yet you haven't mentioned God in any of it. Is you say you're a Christian, but as you plan out your life, God has no part in it. And then he points out the fact that, you can make plans for next year, but you don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. there's an arrogance. There's this idea that you are self-sustaining, that somehow you're in control of the world around you, or at least you have this illusion that you are. And he's pointing out the fact that as you start to walk through life and you make plans, whatever those plans are, God better be at the front of them. You better consult him first, because you can't make plans for tomorrow because you don't know what happens tomorrow. Only he does. And so the bottom line that he's trying to point out here is he's trying to say that you should not make plans without consulting God first. Because, and here's the bottom line, and this comes back to kind of the submit part, is we are supposed to submit every part of our life, including our plans, to God. Okay? So that's kind of the outline. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to check and see if we have any questions.
Okay, do you want me to start, or do you want me
Yeah,
to
no,
read?
keep going.
Okay. All right. That was really good, Cody. Thank you for stepping in and,
Hey,
pinch hitting there.
Yeah, thank you.
I like the plans part just because it's like that's 2020 for us, right?
Yeah.
Like it was like.
Hey, by the way, I think we decided that we were going to try to make that. I don't want when something bad happens or someone makes fun of you or whatever. I think in the future we're going to say you just got 2020'd.
Got 2020'd.
What do you think? Do you think that'll catch on?
Doyle made that up.
Did you make that up?
He did. I think he
Actually,
invented it.
I think I heard
No,
it.
he invented it.
So if something good happens, we're going to say that is so fetch, and if something bad happens, we're going to say that is so 2020.
That's Mean Girls for those of you. It's like Cody's favorite movie, so
Okay.
Okay, so
All right.
I get to be Matt tonight because Matt is out teaching the children right now. So I'm going to be Matt, and so bear with me as I take over his fun things, his big shoes to fill. Well, really small shoes to fill, but
I was looking for questions. It took me a second to hear it.
Okay, so chapter 4 is, I think all of you guys probably have heard the idea of taking something out of context. And honestly, chapter 4, I feel like is a pretty dangerous chapter to take out of context. Because if you were to read chapter 4 as a non-believer, or maybe even just somebody who was kind of I wonder who God is, I feel like chapter 4 kind of sounds like an abusive relationship. Like that. God, it says in, verse 5, that God is jealous. God seems really manipulative in this passage. It's like in verse 3. I was looking at Cody's. When you ask, it's verse 3 and 4. You have to ask in just the right way in order to get what you want from God. You need to be groveling on the floor. You need to be wailing, crying. You need to be submissive to get him to do what you want. And then he seems super duper controlling as well. He won't let us pick our own friends. If we want to be friends with the world, we can't be friends with God. And he won't even let us make our plans without his input. And so if this was a relationship, a human relationship, we would probably all tell you, you need to get out of that relationship. That's an unhealthy relationship. But this is where you cannot take the Bible out of context. So you cannot just read a verse of the Bible or a chapter of the Bible all on its own, because it relates to the verses that are right around it, it relates to the chapters that are right around it, and it relates to the books and the whole Bible all at once. And so in order to really understand what James 4 is saying, you have to understand some things about the Bible. And so there's two fields of study that we're going to talk about tonight, and they're both really important for us to really understand what James is trying to communicate in this passage. And they are anthropology and theology. So anthropology is, I've defined it as the study of the nature of man. So ology means you're going to study something, and anthro is human. So anthropology is the study of the nature of man. Theology is, theos is God, so theology is going to be the study of the nature of God. Okay, so when we study the nature of man as the Bible describes it, so if you, sometimes I get intimidated by the word theology and kind of all the big words that happen in the Bible, but basically they're just the way that people over the ages have thought about God, and just the different trains of thought and the ways that they've thought about him and used to describe him. And they all come from the Bible. And so a lot of anthropology and a lot of theology, if you want to get it all, literally read the Gospel of John and Genesis. 2 books of the Bible, and if you can get those ones down, you've got most theology down. I'm looking at the wrong camera. Hi, guys. Okay, so what those books are telling us is that man, especially we read Genesis, man was created good. We see that in Genesis 1 through 3, that he was created good, and then he chose to sin. And that sin leads to depravity. Now, depravity means that we are completely corrupt. There is nothing about us that is untouched by sin. So there's this concept in Calvinism, which I'm sure Cody can get into more deeply later. The concept of depravity means that everything in our life is corrupted by sin. R.C. Sproul says that we are not sinners because we sin. We sin because we are innately sinners. It doesn't mean that, like when you're a baby, Cody's got little Mr. Jed, who's like one of my favorite people in the world. He was born a sinner. You don't have to teach these little guys how to sin. They know how to sin from the beginning. And it's because when we are conceived, it is in our DNA. We were not created that way. Mankind was not created that way, but our forefathers chose sin, and we now are born into sin. That is the original sin that we are born into. And we are totally, totally depraved. And total depravity doesn't mean that there's nothing good in us. It just means that every single part of us, all of the different parts of us, they are all affected by sin. The way that we love our moms is affected by sin. The way that we relate to nature, it's completely affected by sin. There is not one single part of our lives that is not affected by sin. And the way that I like to think about this is, you guys, I don't think you guys probably like this show or this movie or the books or whatever, but I grew up reading Lord of the Rings, and I love them. Oh, do you?
Yeah, the movie.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were buddies. And C.S. Lewis was obviously a very strong believer. J.R.R. Tolkien had some, I think, Christian influences and Christian leanings, obviously, if he was buddies with C.S. Lewis. But I don't think he completely got the gospel right. But he has some really good ideas. And you see them come out in The Lord of the Rings. And so some of you guys may not know this, but all of the bad characters in Lord of the Rings are perversions of good characters. And so Doyle's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Did you watch them? Oh, you watched them? Okay, good. All right. So if you think about the bad guys, like the ring wraiths.
The original ones in black and white.
Oh, really? I'm like, really? There were?
Just kidding.
Wait, which ones?
I started watch the original
Just
ones.
joking.
In black
They were
and white.
cartoons.
I was just kidding.
Is that the
The original movies.
Oh,
There was a cartoon series.
you're
They
kidding.
existed before the movie. They're books, right?
Yeah.
You were kidding because you weren't allowed to watch TV.
It's also true. Also true.
Okay, but you have to hear my thing, because this was something that I think really developed when the movies came out, is that all of the evil characters are corruptions of the good characters. So the ring wraiths, the really, really bad guys, the Nazgul, they are
Such a nerd.
right. They are corrupted men.
Do you hear that? It's a nerd alert.
Okay, so the ring wraiths, they are corrupted men. The goblins are corrupted dwarves. The orcs are corrupted elves. And it goes out, even the, what are they called? The trolls are corrupted ents. You don't even probably remember what the ents are. They're the trees, whatever. But anyway, so all of those, so if you think about those characters, and Gollum is a corrupted hobbit. And all of those characters, as Tolkien describes them, they're just disgusting. There's absolutely nothing good in them. And in fact, Gollum, who is one of the key characters in the whole story, is this person who has just been so bent and shriveled that the hero, Frodo, is trying to somehow save him, trying to somehow see that there is something good in him. And in the end, he is absolutely, he tries to become good, but his evil that is in him, he can't escape it. It completely, it drags him away, and he ends up dying because of the evil that is in him, and he can't escape it. And that's where J.R.R. Tolkien departs from Christianity, because God, even though we are those wicked, evil orcs and golems and goblins, and that's who we have become. That's who sin has made us. God doesn't leave us there. He actually reaches in and puts his spirit in us, and he changes us. Our hearts are wicked, so he, as Matt has said in the previous weeks, he takes out our hearts and puts new hearts in there. And we begin to become regenerated, and we begin to turn from the inside out. Just as sin from the inside out has made us bad, God has put his Holy Spirit in us, and from the inside out, it is making us good. We're actually becoming an image of who Jesus Christ is. And so that is our anthropology. That is the theology of humans.
So you, while you were saying that, it made me think
study of humans.
It made me think of just how countercultural that message is, and why maybe that's so difficult for people, especially if you grew up as a Christian. Maybe you've heard this before and you go, oh, okay, but think about this from maybe a more like non-Christian point of view, is the fact that you're telling me that I am Gollum,
right,
in my natural disposition, is the exact opposite message that we hear all the time from Oprah.
right.
You know, is like, no, we are a butterfly, and we just need to break loose out of our cocoon and fly, you know?
You're good enough. You're smart enough.
Doggone it, people like
you.
me. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That was a Gen Xer reference right there. Did you see that?
Yeah,
That was a Gen Xer reference. Anyway, I just thought it was very
And
different.
she's wearing a sweater,
Yeah.
which goes with that.
Where's the mirror?
What's his name wear? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so that is anthropology. Like when you think of who mankind is in their natural state, we are Gollum. Like that's what we are. And I'm going to get back to this. Is God controlling? Is he manipulative? And is he jealous? But that's what we need to understand about mankind. Then the theology, the study of who God is, there's a few different arguments that they all come out of the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible does it explicitly say this ontological argument, but this is what Christians throughout the ages, from studying Scripture, these are the things that we know from God, from his Scripture. So the first one that we know about God kind of falls under the heading, and I think Matt has mentioned it before, it's called the Ontological Argument. And this was developed like in 400 AD or something by St. Anselm, like one of the early theologians of the church. And he basically said that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So you cannot even imagine anything bigger or better or in any way greater than God. He is the largest conceivable being that there is. So God is...
He's the greatest.
The greatest.
The greatest conceivable being.
Didn't I say?
You said largest.
Oh, greatest. Well, greatest conceivable. Great. Thank you for correcting me.
I'm sorry. When you do
Appreciate it.
philosophy,
I
they
know.
get super upset when you're like, oh no, that's not the right word there. It's like,
Greatest. Okay. Greatest conceivable being. But I did say greater here because that is a quote. Okay, so what that means kind of in terms that we can understand a little bit better is that God is omnipotent, so omnipotent, which means he's all-powerful. He is omnipresent, meaning he is everywhere at once. He is omniscient, not omniscient. Omniscient means he knows everything. He knows everything that has been, everything that is, and everything that ever will be. And on top of all of this, he is omni benevolent. Thank you to Josh who reminded me of that word, omni benevolent. And that means that everything about him is good and has good intent for us. So he is all loving, all merciful, all just. If you take love, if you take mercy, if you take justice to their utter ends, you will find God. God is at the end of all of that. And so if you take these two things, that man is utterly sinful and God is the very definition of what it means to be good, and you look at this situation, or let's look at this situation. You look at life, okay? So God has taken us. He loves us because he is all loving, and we are like these precious little children of his, and we are just traipsing through a field of life, and what we don't understand is that field has landmines in it. The minefield of life is in front of us. And so I think, like, if you can think in your head of your favorite 10-year-old and how full of life and joy and how seeking after pleasures they are in life, they just want to have fun. And they go out into a field, and you know that that field is full of landmines. But the thing is, you know how to get through that field safely. You know the best steps that they can take. You know how they can avoid all of those landmines. Think about how stressed you would be if your precious child or your beloved child was running through that field. You would take some pretty extreme measures. You would use some loud and controlling words to guide them through that minefield because you don't want them to get blown up, because you love them. And because these little people, us, our little golem selves, we are constantly seeking pleasure. And our hearts are wicked and deceitful. And all our hearts want to do is drive us right into every single one of these mines. And they are going to destroy us. And so in that, we come back to these questions. Is God controlling? Is he manipulative? Is he jealous? And this is my big reveal. I was super excited. I have a surprise board. I know.
No.
Yeah. So, is God controlling? No. God has given us free will. He has given us the ability to act at our own discretion. But our problem is that we have this hedonistic heart that is going to direct us to the bad places. Our heart is, in Genesis 6:5, it talks about man's heart right before the flood, that it was always evil. Every inclination of their hearts was always evil all the time. And Jeremiah 17:9 says that the same thing. Out of your heart, like your heart is the source of all of the evil in your life. And that is the problem, because our heart is directing our will. And so God is controlling us because he knows that our heart is going to lead us into those mines. So he says, follow my plan. I know the way around those things. You guys, submit your hearts to me so that I can keep you out of trouble. And the interesting thing is, in this kind of section, like some of the verses that talk about God being controlling, they mention a little bit about the devil. And it says, you know, Cody, in his 10 Commandments that he was mentioning, it says that we need to resist the devil. And I think a lot of people get really focused on Satan, and they want to study him, and they want to know like how they can avoid him, or, you know, steer clear of him in their life. And they're very afraid. We're very afraid of the devil and of demons, and they are powerful. However, if you look at what James says about the devil, he says that really the way we conquer the devil is we resist him. And there is something in our everyday life that is so much more dangerous and so much more wicked, and it's our own desire. He says that the devil will flee if we resist him. But our own desire, if you look back into chapter 1, he says that our own desires entice us and then drag us off and enslave us. And we spend all this time being afraid of demons and Satan, and it's our desires that we should be terrified of, because our desires are what are always going to lead us into the minefield in a bad way. Okay, then the second thing is God manipulative? Do we have to always ask in the right way? Do we have to do things exactly the way he wants, or else he is going to get us? And the thing that we have to remember that is that it goes back to James chapter 1, that God gives us good gifts, and his good gifts, they're only for our good. His good gifts are only for our good. I got to look at my notes really quick and make sure I don't miss anything. Oh, the other thing about this God being manipulative, like, because that he wants us to, I think this is one of the hardest parts, is that God wants us to humble ourselves, like wants us to get down low before he'll pick us up. And the way I was thinking about this, I'm talking about kids a lot tonight, but I don't know, they're on my head. But I just was thinking of a toddler trying to like get up on a table that's too high for them. And you're standing right next to them. Like, they can't pick themselves up by their arm. They can't pick themselves up by the back of their head. They can't even climb on the table. And until they actually say, I can't do this by myself, there's no way that you can really help them, because they're a toddler and they're going to throw a fit. And so until they look at you and they say, I can't do this, please help me, or they say like up, which is probably more along the toddler, then you can lift them up and you can put them where they need to be. And that's like a super simplistic way of describing what God does for us, is that God has plans for us. He has good gifts in store for us. But until we recognize that we're Gollum, that we are never going to choose anything good on our own because we have evil desires, he will not. He's a gentleman. He will not give us what we haven't asked for. And so we need to ask for it. We need to get ourselves into a place where we are humble enough to ask for God's help, because he is omniscient. He knows the way. He knows the right things that we need to choose. And then the last thing, which is, I think, seriously one of the best ones, is the idea that God is a jealous God. Because we look at this idea of jealousy as a bad thing. But what he has just done in the verse right before it says that God is jealous is he has reminded us that, James has reminded us that our relationship with God is a symbolic marriage to God. And so God has actually given us, I want to talk a little bit about the symbolism of marriage. God has actually given us marriage as one of the most powerful images of what our relationship with him should look like. And I was thinking about this the other day. My boys are in high school now, and they're, at some point going to start dating, which is terrifying, and I'm not super excited about it. But I was looking at them the other day and thinking about how much I love them, how wonderful they are to me, and that how much as a mom I value them, and and I looked at one of my kids, and then I turned and I looked at the other one and thought, oh, I sure love him, and oh, I sure love him. And I thought about it, and I thought, I am so excited that one day I'm going to cry if I say this, that there is going to be a woman that looks at my boys and they say, I love only him. There's no other boy that I love as much as that one boy. I love the way he laughs. I love the way he thinks. I think he makes the best choices that anyone could possibly make. And that's what marriage does, is it says, I choose this one person, and they are the most important person to me. There's nobody else in the world that will listen to me the way that they do. There's nobody who is just for me the way that they will. I have a quote by Tim Keller, and it says, within this Christian vision of marriage, here's what it means to fall in love. It is to look at another person and get a glimpse of what God is creating and say, I see who God is making you to be, and it excites me. I want to be part of that. I want to partner with you and with God on the journey that you are taking to his throne. And when we get there to his throne, I will look at your magnificence and say, I always knew you could be like this. I got glimpses of it on earth. Now look at you. And I just think that is what marriage is all about. And that's how we should feel about God, and that is how he feels about us. He looks at us and he says, there is nobody that I love like I love Autumn. There is nobody that I love that way. And so if you have any kind of a marriage that is anything close to anything like that, so let's just say a healthy marriage, and your spouse flirts with someone else, tries to give any of that attention that is supposed to be focused solely on you, you're going to rightfully be jealous. If you're not jealous, then you don't have a good marriage. They cannot act that way. When you're in a marriage, part of the definition of marriage is that focused love and attention, that devotion that God has given us for our spouse is focused only on our spouse. It's not focused on anyone else. So that is these kind of three big topics in the context of Scripture as a whole. And that's my stab at theology.
Great. That was really good. You took a lot of notes over there, dude.
Oh, she just had a lot of great stuff.
No. Should we just end it here and be done, or what?
We could, but
No.
we won't, but we could. So, a country song. I was what she wanted, she was what I needed. It's a country song, right? We are what God wants. God is what we need. He doesn't need us. He just wants. That came to my mind. That was interesting. All right, good. You have questions and stuff?
No. Oh, I was thinking is that, you use that illustration of the toddler asking to be put up on. So that's like the difference between like Reformed and Arminianism. Is Arminianism says up, please, and Reformed or Calvinist, God just put you up on the table. That's a theology joke, sort of. That's all I got.
And you called me a nerd.
Yeah. By the way, at some point we need to go through the ontological argument.
Exactly. That's where I was going to go.
I didn't get it good enough.
Well,
No,
there's an
it's
argument
hard
there.
to grab.
And it is hard. I tried to explain it to you one time. So Anselm is from the 11th century, and he came up with this argument, and it sounds as if you're pulling like a mind trick on someone, but it's a really, really good argument that people still use to this day. There's different versions of it, like really, really complex versions. Alvin Plantinga, who's a philosopher, if you're into this, has like the modal version, and it's the idea that God is the greatest conceivable being, and so think of the greatest conceivable being and all the traits that God would have, which is what you said, all those omni traits. Well, one of the traits that the greatest conceivable being would have is existence, because existence is greater than non-existence. So therefore, God exists.
which those of us not trained in logic or in philosophy don't get.
Oh, it just
we don't
seems
get
absurd.
that, because it almost seems like you're making an argument for, if God is the greatest imaginable thing, greatest thing we could imagine,
Greatest conceivable being.
then we made him up because we conceived him.
Right, but is it so you think of all these traits, like think of this, it would be personal, and not only would it be personal, but it would be eternal, because it's better to have existed forever than only temporary. Come up with all of these things, and then you get to the last step, which is now, is it greater, this greatest conceivable being, is it greater if this being actually exists or only exists in our imagination? Which is greater? To exist in the real world, well, there you go, to actually exist. So, it exists. I know. You're gonna have to look it up.
I read that article, the passage that.
Yeah, there's actually a great video by Reasonable Faith on the ontological argument. There's a 5-minute video, and it explains it. Check it out if you're interested.
And if you don't get it, don't feel bad, because it's a little hard. Can I take a run at this, an application of that?
Yep.
Since you guys like to exist up here and I like to live in a real world. So let me take a run at asking you guys some questions about it. Okay. So would it be fair to say that if God didn't exist, we couldn't imagine him?
Are you asking me this?
I'm asking you this question.
False.
Because?
My dog cannot imagine God.
But he still exists.
But he still exists.
Well, and
People
like Roman gods don't exist, and people
But they
imagine
imagine.
them.
Okay. All right. Could I ask, if God didn't exist, would we still know what love is?
No.
If God didn't exist, would we know what justice is?
No.
If God didn't exist, we know
Well,
what mercy
hold on.
is.
How deep philosophically do you want to go into this? So the reason why we know what love is so there's two. Okay, again, this is like total philosophy nerd stuff right here. So you can just ignore it if you want. So what you talked about there is ontology, and ontology is asking the question what exists, and epistemology asks how do we know certain things. So one is how do we know what exists, what exists. The other is how do we know the things that we know, or how do we come to know things. And so if you're asking ontologically, there would be no such thing as love if God did not exist. But do we have to believe in God to know that love exists? No.
Right. So is the existence of love evidence of God's existence?
Yes.
Is the existence of justice the evidence that God exists?
Yeah. Dennis Prager, he's a Jewish political commentator.
Started out as more of a theology guy, but became political.
He said the main reason why he believes in God is because he has such a strong sense of justice that the only way that he could live this life is knowing there's some sort of justice in this world and after this.
Right.
So his sense of justice is so strong that it's stronger than any counter evidence that he would have that God does not exist. And God would have to exist for there to be ultimately justice.
Okay. So because love exists, because justice exists, because mercy exists, are there any other explanations other than a God reflecting his character in us for those to exist? In a purely, what which am I looking?
Naturalistic.
Naturalistic view.
Yeah,
of it, is it?
materialistic world. No, you can come up with other possibilities, but I think that the end they all fail. So you could come up with an adaptive feature of evolutionary biology, which it helped us continue to pass on our genes to the next generation, and so we we adapted and had this thing called empathy or whatever, because it helps us get along, helps us survive, things like that. Or it could be beneficial for us somehow, and so at the end it's really like we don't have empathy, we're empathetic so that we can get things, so it's a power move. There's lots of different, and philosophers have been talking about this forever. At the end of the day, the only way that it ontologically exists, like it's a real thing, not something that we made up. So we could say it's societal, right? Like the reason why we think X, Y, or Z is wrong is because we were brought up to believe that because of the culture. So it's the cultural values. All of those explanations fail.
Because?
So the classic example is, one, if it's just an evolutionary byproduct, we could have developed a different set of morals. So you look in the animal kingdom, and I'm really into National Geographic right now. I don't know why. I think I'm at the end of YouTube and Netflix, and their value system is far different than ours. So like if you look at lions and sharks and things like that, there's not empathy. There's food, right? Or if you look at sharks, the way that they mate is what we would consider rape. And yet we don't try to lock them up in jail because we have a different set of values than they do. But if it's simply a byproduct of evolution, we could have just as easily developed the value systems that they have instead of what we have. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would say, well, if evolution had gone different, sure, rape would have not been a big deal, right? No one says that. Everyone thinks it's an issue. So what you're saying is there's this superseding law, the superseding value system that is beyond just evolution. So there is no world in which we think, molesting and raping and torturing children is okay. That is just objectively wrong. Even, if somehow it became advantageous for us and we developed this evolutionary, system. So I don't think that's the explanation. And then society, the same thing. Is if all of our values are societal, then we could have said, okay, well, the Nazis win the war. They either kill or brainwash everyone who disagrees with them. So the whole world says it's beneficial for humankind to persecute and to kill Jews. Is it now okay? If they're simple culturally,
okay.
If it's simply cultural values that we hold, well, all of culture says this is okay. Is it okay? I'm reading a book right now about the first century. And in Rome, they thought it was okay to take women as slaves and use them for their own pleasure and to throw kids in drainage ditches if they didn't want to. The whole culture said it was okay. Do we think it's okay?
Right.
No, because we are saying that there is a law above just even our cultural laws.
But did they think it was okay?
They thought it was okay.
So then our culture's just changed, that's all.
If there is no law, if there is no superseding law, if there is no law that stands above the law, so God's law that stands above cultural law, then we have no right to say that what they're doing was wrong.
So certainly the Jews believed that was wrong at the time.
Right.
They were living outside of even
Well, they were living according to the laws given to them in the Ten Commandments and as revealed in the Old Testament. And so they had God's law. And so they believed it was wrong. And they believed it was wrong not because of what culture said, but because of what God said. I didn't know we were going philosophical tonight.
Wow.
Yeah, that's exciting. You're like, let's get practical for a minute here. All right, let's talk the ontological argument.
Well, I think it's a great example. What the Romans did was life minus God, the true God. What the Jews were doing was life with God, maybe not correctly, but with God, and they live differently. And if we eliminate God from our society and our culture, we will begin to lose what is true and practice things that are abhorrent.
Yeah, so I've talked about this a little bit, but there are some, not even Christians, but who actually talked about this first was Nietzsche. He talked about the death of God. And when he talked about the death of God, he wasn't advocating for, so he's obviously an atheist, and he wasn't advocating for societies to get rid of God. What he was saying was, as societies get rid of God, how are we going to know which way is up and which way is down? How are we going to know what is right and what is wrong? And he says, he's really warning us that what happens when a society eliminates God is you have now taken any kind of objective standard for right and wrong, any kind of objective values, any kind of justice in the end, and now it's just whoever has the most power wins. And so it's no coincidence that Nietzsche says this. Then Hitler and other people take his writings, they start to implement it, start to believe it, and then the 20th century becomes the bloodiest in all of human history because they went, yeah, you're right. If God doesn't, who is it? Russian writer, famous.
Solzhenitsyn?
No, further back.
Nietzsche?
Brother Dostoevsky. Without God, all things are permissible, and that's kind of the idea behind it.
So I was going to say, I had an example of this just this last week. Like it happens, it's alive and active in our society. So my son, I was supposed to pick him up from a very specific spot after school. He's at Los Al High School, and he didn't show up to his spot. And what I found out later was that he doesn't have a very good sense of direction, and he overshot it, and he got lost. And so he ended up from Los Al, he was over by the medical center. Like he walked all the way over there and then realized that he was in the wrong spot, and then was like literally running from there, like back to where Nick's is, and like all around with his backpack on, and was just like super stressed. He's a freshman, he's 14 years old. And I asked him finally when I found him. I'm like, I just drove through the neighborhood until I found him. And when I finally picked him up, I said, why didn't you ask anybody if you could just use their phone? And he said, I did. Nobody would let me use their phone because of COVID.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, well, first off, I said, did you tell them that you're a child? Because he's 6 foot tall. And so I thought they might think he was like some sort of a hoodlum, but he's 6 foot tall. And I just thought, what kind of wicked people do we live around that they wouldn't see a child in distress and they would be like that they wouldn't figure out a way to help him, you know,
Right.
but they're so focused on their own selves that, you know, so we had to talk about how he could have made better choices, but I was just so upset by the fact, like I thought, now he didn't run into anybody from Seacoast, or he didn't run into any Christians, because in our hearts, we're supposed to do that.
Right,
You know, we
right.
know that we're supposed to help.
Which we're going to talk about this weekend, actually. Promo for the weekend services. We're going to talk a lot about that. So
Yeah, well, I planned that.
thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for setting this up.
Do we have any questions you want to add?
Yeah, go ahead. Do your thing.
So here's what I got a phone call this week from a pastor of a smaller church. He's got a guy who's kind of causing some grief in their church. Smaller churches are difficult because, you know, fewer people and they get to everybody. So the guy's been advocating to try to help lead it and so on. I told a story about something very similar to this in my last devotional. He says, so this pastor is asking, what should I do with this person? Because I've told him a no on a couple of occasions because I don't think he's healthy. And so we talked about how you deal with somebody who's really trying to insert themselves into leadership, and how you're probably not going to fix that because he's not really asking you what he's asking you. He doesn't even know what he's asking you. I want to help lead, but there's a sense that it's unhealthy. What he's really saying is there is some pleasure within me, the desire to be recognized, the desire for power, the desire for whatever, that he hasn't come to grips with yet. And so you're telling me he can't lead isn't going to fix anything. He's just going to go try to do this at another place. And I asked about his history, and he's done it several different places. So here's what's interesting is that when it talks about if there's war inside, so it begins, this very chapter begins with it's warring inside of you. What you really need is warring inside of you, right? No wonder our relational world is in trouble, because what wars on the inside will eventually cause war on the outside. One of the hardest things for me as a pastor was coming to grips that I can't fix anybody. At first I thought maybe I could fix a few people. I can't fix, because I have to start with my own heart, and that's about the only thing I get to do. The only thing I can do is invite others to look at their own heart, because whatever's warring with them in them, it's some desire. So you're talking about the things that we have to guard against. We have to guard against the devil, but you're right, that's almost the least. Our own desires, or flesh, as it's called in earlier translations. Our own desires or urges, the flesh, our old nature, and then the cultural influences around us. And so we look at the world, and we have become emboldened because of the internet, I think, to argue in ways we'd never have done before. But all that tells me, when I meet somebody argumentative, somebody who is trying to cause conflict with me or in an organization or whatever, it's because there's a war inside of them. And would I be accurate in saying that the real hope for bringing about some civility and some peace is that everybody's heart needs to be exposed to the God who is merciful and just and loving? And so a part of what happens I see right now, and I get sucked into it too, it's the world part of it that gets me, because the world says argue or hang out with people who see like you do, and then you all foment together and whatever. But at the end of the day, I need to get rid of the warring within me. And I'll be less apt to war with you or with you, even if you're completely wrong, which you are most of the time. She's not so much. But so I thought that was interesting. How much time do we have? We're about done.
I have one thing. Can I say?
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. If you see a conflict, then you know that somewhere there's a wicked desire. Like it may not be in you, but it's somewhere, somewhere in that. If there's a conflict, there's a wicked desire.
And usually what's interesting is conflict in somebody else usually generates conflict in me, because my ego wants to rise up and go. By the way, as much of this passage is about ego. Like further on when it says, if you plan to go to this city, you go to this city, whatever it is, and you brag about it, there's a really interesting phrase in that. I think it's verse 16. It says that let me just read that real quick so I get the words exactly right. As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. And the word evil there actually is an aggressive, vicious wickedness. In other words, you've so excluded God from the equation of your life, whether it's your plans or your urges, your pleasures, desires, that it becomes aggressively evil. I feel like we live in a world that is aggressively evil. That people are so bought into that somehow down here that they've got it together. If they can just get their way, it's going to work out. That's the problem with the guy that called me, the guy he's dealing with that called me. It's a problem with the world. I see it's a problem with me. I just fall into this mindset that if I can just get my way, then it's all going to work out. But even our prayers. So we have wrong motives, we have wrong actions, and we have wrong prayers. All because I think if I can just get my way. It all kind of, and this whole thing kind of, for me, kind of comes together. And then in verse 17, I love what he says there. He says, anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, sins. He's saying, I've warned you.
Statement.
I've warned you. Consider yourself warned. If you keep down this path, if you keep going down this path of seeking your own urges, if you keep going down this thing, what's the war inside is going to come outside. It's going to destroy your relationships. It's going to destroy your life. It's going to destroy all this stuff. Really, so for me, I'm not expressing it very well, but there is an interesting cohesion in this whole thing, and it's all about that war that starts inside of you in verse 1.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about what you said a second ago, which is all conflict is because of a wrong desire or incorrect desire. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and I would amend it to like a fight or a quarrel, because I think.
Well, I don't even know, but I don't know if that's. I was thinking about it, and I thought, wait, is that true? Is all conflict because of a wrong desire? And it might be true. I got to think more about.
If you differentiate between conflict and disagreement.
Well, hold on, because is there conflict or disagreement in heaven?
No.
So if there's not, then it's due to some sinful issue that we have here, or a sinful nature, right? And so, man, that statement's kind of crazy. I got to think more about that, because even things that, like we disagree on something, like let's say that we're talking about a song that we want to, the band to do or something like that, and it's not like the disagreement is bad, because we both want the same thing, the best song on this weekend or whatever it is, but yet maybe behind that there is something there, that there is a desire to get your way, or there is, and maybe it's just an incorrect view of the world and yourself. Do you know what I'm saying? Gosh, I got.
It doesn't take long in a disagreement to dig in and to take sides. I think the other thing that causes conflict is that we have this subconscious presupposition that there is a magic bullet somewhere, or a magic pill, that if I can just get what I want, if I keep getting all the things I want, eventually I'm going to get that magic pill, it's going to make me okay. And that's why Jesus is so jealous for us, because he is the magic that is going to make us okay. And I think he's greatly disappointed when we don't choose him. I don't know. That's some thoughts.
That's good. That's really good. All right, any last thoughts? Why do people need to be here this weekend for service?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been talking about is we have kind of over the past 6-7 months, because of this pandemic, have focused on our own belly buttons. Basically, been sitting around going, I hope I don't get sick.
And you know what's weird is it's getting closer and closer for where I can see it.
It's more obvious.
Easier and
It's
easier
getting,
to
it's
see.
just like, whoa, it's getting right there.
But we decided a few weeks ago that we need to kind of start looking outside ourselves. And so we reached out to some of our long-term international ministry partners and to find out what's going on in some other locations around the world, people we've worked with for 10, 15, 20 years, to see how it's going. And we came back with some very interesting reports, and we found some ways we can help. And we can't all get on a plane and go there. Matter of fact, none of us get on a plane and go there to most of the places, but we can help. And we found out what the needs are. We're going to be talking about how one of the greatest things Christians do, and this ties into what you're reading these days, is we make a difference in the world. We help in practical ways. And so we're going to talk about maybe how we can think about this situation in terms of our impact.
What if we went from being the people who shout the loudest to the people who serve the loudest? Oh! All right.
Close. It was close.
Okay.
Serve the most.
Serve the most. Serve the.
We'll wordsmith that a little bit. It's close.
Okay. That was just. I was just trying to like kind of
It was
just.
close. It was close.
All right.
Close.
All right. All right. Anyway, guys, thanks for joining us. Thanks for missing out on the debate to see our own debate. Okay. Anyway, hope to see you guys there this weekend. It's going to be a really fun weekend, and we have some cool stuff coming up, so make sure you're there and be praying for our youth as they're out there for their first night tonight and all the other stuff that's kicking off at Seacoast. So check it out, and we'll see you this weekend. God bless.